For much of my life, I've not been a Christian. My parents were not churchgoers. In fact, as a teenager, I was really quite hostile to the Christian faith. I think I would have described myself probably as an atheist, possibly as an agnostic. That was the way my father described himself. I don't know why it was, but I felt something about Christians that I felt rather suspicious about, and I always avoided them. In my first year at university, I was sharing rooms with a very good friend of mine who I'd known I've known now for 30 years, but then we've been at school together. He was a very good friend of mine. And I warned him. I said, whatever you do, don't let Christians into your room. Keep well away. Talk to them outside and shut the door firmly. And one day, to my horror, he came back. He'd been at some meeting, and he said that he and his then girlfriend, now wife, Scylla, had become Christians. And I thought, he's such a nice guy. And I thought, the Moonies have got him. And I thought, what's going to happen to him? But I realized I knew very little about Christianity. So I thought I'd better investigate. So I thought I would read all about religion and philosophy. I thought I'd read the Quran. I'd read about Marx, Sartre, and existentialism. But that night, and it was quite late at night, I didn't have any of that, but I sort of looked on my shelf, and the only thing that I could see was an old dusty Bible that I'd had at school. Well, I thought I'll start with that. And that night I started reading Matthew's Gospel. And I read the whole way through Matthew, and I read the whole way through Mark, the whole way through Luke, and I got about halfway through John's Gospel about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I fell asleep. Following morning, I finished John's Gospel. I read on through the rest of the New Testament. That day, the next day, the following day, I just carried on reading it. I was a student. I didn't have any work to do. And I carried on until I completed the New Testament. And by the time I got to the end of it, I had reached the conclusion that it was true. I didn't much like that conclusion, because I realized I then had to make a decision. And what I want to look at this evening is, on what basis do we say that we believe it's true? What is the evidence for Christianity? There's an old communist Russian dictionary which says about Jesus that he's a mythical figure who never existed. I don't think any serious historian would take that position today. There's a great deal of evidence that Jesus existed. There's evidence first outside the New Testament. The Roman historian Tacitus speaks about him directly. Another Roman historian, Suetonius, speaks about him indirectly. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing very close to the time, wrote in his Antiquities of the Jews, in a section where he talks about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, about Annas, Caiaphas, Pontius Pilate. He then goes on to say, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And he goes on to speak about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament, but there's also, and more importantly really, there's evidence inside the New Testament. Some people say, well, the New Testament was written a long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is we do know very accurately through a science called textual criticism. We know what the New Testament writers actually wrote. Professor F.F. Bruce, Ryland Professor of Biblical Criticism and Exegesis at the University of Manchester, wrote a book called The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? And he shows how rich the New Testament is in manuscript attestation by comparing the texts of other historical works. And essentially, the shorter the time span between when the manuscript was written and the earliest copy, and the higher number of copies that we have, the less doubt there is about what the original authors wrote. So you'll see in the table there in your notes, Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy that we have is around AD 900. So there's a 1300-year gap. We have 8 copies of each, and yet no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Tacitus, 1,000-year gap, 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950-year gap, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap, 20 copies. The New Testament, written between 40 and 100 AD, the earliest copy we have is AD 130, and we have full manuscripts AD 350. So at most there's a 300-year gap. And not just 8 or 20 manuscripts, we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, 9,300 others. F.J.A. Hort summarizes that evidence by saying this: in the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings. That is not a conclusion that any secular historian would disagree with. F.F. Bruce, summarizing that evidence, quotes Sir Frederick Kenyon, a leading scholar in this area. The interval between the dates of original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. And the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. So there's evidence inside and outside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But who was he? We know that he was fully human. I heard Martin Scorsese say on television that he made the film The Last Temptation of Christ to show that Jesus was a real human being. But for most people today, that's not the issue. We know that Jesus was fully human. He had a human body. He could be tired, hungry. He could suffer pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experiences: birth, growing up, education, temptation, job, bereavement, suffering, rejection, death. But many today say, well, Jesus was only a human being, albeit a great religious teacher. I think Billy Connolly spoke for many when he said, I can't believe in Christianity, but I think Jesus was a wonderful man. He was a great religious teacher. The issue is this: what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? Would you like to turn to Matthew chapter 16, verse 13? When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" The Son of Man was Jesus' favorite way of referring to himself. They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." In other words, they're saying, you're a great religious teacher. "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." It's possible to be with someone for a long time, and not realize who they are. I really enjoy playing squash, and I belong to a squash club which also has a gym. And if there's no one there to play squash with, I'll go into the gym. One time I was there in the gym, and I was sort of doing weights with a guy who turned out to be Paul Ackford, the England rugby international. I didn't realize that at the time, but I was going around doing weights with him. He was doing these huge, great weights, and I was doing puny little weights. I said, "What's your main sport?" And I think he assumed that I would know that he played rugby, so he said, well, I play a bit of squash. So I said, is that your main sport? He said, no. He said, my main sport is rugby. So I said, do you play for a club? He said, yeah, I play for Harlequins. So I said, oh, Harlequins, I've heard of that. They're rather good, aren't they? He said, yeah. I said, don't they have some people who play for England in their team? He said, yeah, there are 5 people. So I said, have you ever played for England? He said, yeah. I said, when did you last play for England? He said, 2 weeks ago during the World Cup. And I looked at him, I said, you're Paul Eckford. I'd been with him that time, but I hadn't realized who he was. And the disciples had been with Jesus all that time. And suddenly Peter looks at Jesus and he says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. The question is this: was he right? What's the evidence? There are 2 parts to the argument. First of all, who did Jesus think he was? Some say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. Of course, it's true that he didn't go around saying, I am God. But when one looks at all that he claimed and taught, there is little doubt that he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. So that's the first part. What did Jesus say about himself? And secondly, was he right? What evidence is there to support what he said? So the first part of the argument. What did he say about himself? Here there are 3 pieces of evidence. First of all, his teaching centered on himself. Most good religious teachers point away from themselves and to God. They say, don't look at me, look at God. Jesus, in pointing to God, pointed to himself. That it's through him that we encounter God. In every human heart, there is a hunger. 3 leading psychologists of the 20th century have all recognized this. Jung said, people are hungry for security. Adler, people are hungry for significance. Freud, people are hungry for love. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you want those hungers satisfied, come to me. Many people are walking around today in depression, disillusionment, despair, even darkness. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. I remember somebody on the Alpha course, just after they had come to Christ, they said this to me. They said, it was as if the light had suddenly been turned on and I could see things for the first time. Many today are fearful of death. We tend not to talk about death so much anymore. I gather now in hospitals, it's not really politically correct even to use the word death. They have another politically correct way of describing it: negative patient care outcome. But people die nevertheless. And Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will live even though they die. Somebody asked Mother Teresa shortly before she died, are you at all afraid of dying? And her answer was, how can I be? Dying is going home to God. I've never been afraid. No, she said, on the contrary, I'm looking forward to it. Many are dissatisfied with materialism, and they're searching for some kind of spiritual reality. Jesus said, I'm the way. And he is searching for some kind of value system. Jesus said, I'm the truth. People are looking for, what is the point of life? What's its meaning? What is its purpose? Jesus said, I am the life. Others said, that's the way, that's the truth, that's the life. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. Many are burdened by worries and anxieties and fears and guilt. Jesus said, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Many are not sure about how they should be running their lives. What kind of model should we be following? The traditional models that people have often followed are now breaking down. Who should we follow? Jesus said, follow me. He said to receive him was to receive God. He said to welcome him was to welcome God. He said to have seen him was to have seen God. I heard of a child who came home from church one Sunday morning and was doing a drawing. And there's a little girl, and the mother asked, darling, what are you drawing? And she said, I'm drawing a picture of God. The mother said, well, don't be silly, darling. You can't draw a picture of God. Nobody knows what God looks like. The girl said, well, they will do when I finish my picture. Jesus said, if you have seen me, you have seen God. So that his teaching, which was centered on himself, then his indirect claims. Jesus said a number of things which, although not direct claims to be God, show that he regarded himself as being in the same position as God. He claimed to be able to forgive sins. Now, to forgive people who've sinned against us is something that we can all do as human beings. But to forgive those who have sinned against others is something only God can do. And when Jesus claimed the authority to forgive the sins of those who'd sinned against others, he was accused of blasphemy. The lawyers said to him, who can forgive sins but God alone? And then he claimed that he was the one who was going to judge the world. He said that one day all the nations would be gathered before him and he would separate them like sheep and goats. And the criteria of judgment would be how we have responded to him in this life. These are not the kind of things that a great religious teacher would say. I mean, if your local vicar gets up and says, one day I'm going to judge the world, and everyone's going to be divided, sheep and goats, and the test is going to be how you have responded to me, we would think that was a very odd thing to say. And then his direct claims. He claimed, as we've seen, to be the Christ, the Son of God. And such a claim, tantamount to a claim to be God, was regarded as blasphemy in Jewish eyes, worthy of death. And then he went even further. He claimed to be God the Son. Would you like to turn to John chapter 20, verses 28 and 29? This is after his resurrection. Jesus appeared to the disciples, and the disciples told their friend Thomas, who hadn't been there when Jesus had appeared to them, that they'd seen Jesus. And Thomas was a skeptic. He said, well, look, I'm not going to believe that unless I see for myself, unless I actually see the wounds in his hands and actually put my hand in the wound in his side, I won't believe. And then Jesus appears. And he says to Thomas, stop doubting and believe. And verse 28, Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Thomas called him God. And Jesus didn't say, hang on a second, now that's going too far. Jesus said to him, because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Otherwise, he says, you were a bit slow getting the point. If you'd like to turn back a few pages to John chapter 10, verse 31. Verse 30, I think we'll pick up the story. If anyone ever says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you only had time to show them one verse, you might like to turn to this passage. John 10, verse 30. Jesus says, I and the Father are one. Again, the Jews picked up stones to stone him. But Jesus said to them, I have shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, replied the Jews, but for blasphemy. Because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. So that's the first part of the argument. Jesus claimed to be God. But that's not the end of the argument, of course, because a claim like that has to be tested. All sorts of people make all kinds of claims. The mere fact that somebody claims to be somebody doesn't mean they're necessarily right. There are many people, some in psychiatric hospitals, who are deluded. They think that they're Napoleon, or they think they're Elvis Presley, or they think they're the Pope, or they think they're God. But they're not. How can we test such people's claims? Well, Jesus claimed to be the unique Son of God, God made flesh. There seem to me to be three logical possibilities. Number one, it was not true, but he didn't realize it wasn't true. In other words, he was deluded, insane. Second logical possibility is that it's not true, and he knew perfectly well it wasn't true, in which case he was an imposter, and an evil one at that. And the third logical possibility is that it's true. C.S. Lewis put it like this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be, and I think the word that C.S. Lewis would probably use now is insane, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else insane, or something worse. But don't let's come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. So, what evidence is there to support what he said? I'd like to look at 5 pieces of evidence. Number one, his teaching, what he said. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching that has ever fallen from anyone's lips. The Sermon on the Mount. Love your neighbor as yourself. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemies. Do to others what you would have them do to you. Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of our entire civilization in the West. Many of our laws were originally based on the teaching of Jesus. We're making progress in every field of science and technology. We travel faster, we know more, yet in 2,000 years, no one has ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus Christ. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words that you'd expect God to speak. Could that teaching have come from someone who was insane or evil? Then they're his works, what he did. Jesus must have been the most extraordinary and wonderful person to be around. Sometimes people say, oh, Christianity is so boring. But I don't think it would ever have been boring to be with Jesus. It must have been such fun being with Jesus. Imagine going to a party with Jesus. Do you remember he went to a party and the wine ran out? And he said to them, oh, don't worry, just go and fill some jars with some bath water and start pouring that out. So with some fear and trepidation, they filled them with water, and then they started to pour the bath water into the glasses. And out came Chateau Lafite, 45. BC, that is. Or think what fun it would be to go on a picnic with Jesus. Remember he went on a picnic once? No need to bring sandwiches. Or even think what fun it would be to go to a funeral with Jesus. Do you remember he went to a funeral once? And he said, take the stone away from the tomb. And they said, oh, but we can't do that. He's been dead for 4 days. That'd be the most terrible smell if we do that. Jesus said, take it away. And then he called out, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus came out. And he said, take the grave clothes off him and let him go. Not just his miracles, but his love for the people that society had rejected. The lepers, the outcasts. Transforming people's lives. He's still doing that today. And then being willing to lay down his own life. Are these the deeds of somebody who's insane or evil? Then his character. His character has impressed millions who wouldn't necessarily call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this about Jesus. Jesus, the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western man. Supreme unselfishness, but never self-pity. Humility, but not weakness. Joy, but never at somebody else's expense. Kindness, but not indulgence. And then, of course, a real test is when we're under pressure, when we're in pain. And Jesus, in excruciating pain, said about the people who were doing it to him, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. His enemies could find no fault in him. And his friends said, this man has no sin. Then, fourthly, there's his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one in the history of the world has ever had a whole collection of books written about them before they were born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies written over a period of hundreds of years. 29 of them he fulfilled in a single day. Now, I suppose you could say, well, maybe he read the Old Testament and he thought, well, these are the things I got to do. So he went through his life deliberately trying to fulfill all those prophecies. The trouble with that is many of the things he had no control over. Many of the things were about how he was going to die, the place that he was going to be buried, about his resurrection. Even the place of his birth was foretold. If he's reading through the Old Testament and suddenly discovered that, it's too late. Fifthly, his conquest of death. The physical resurrection of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. Sometimes people say, on Alpha, why don't you start with, is there a God? Say, you start with Jesus, but I didn't even believe there's a God. The New Testament theologian Tom Wright put it like this: the Christian claim is not that Jesus is to be understood in terms of a God about whom we already know. It is this: the resurrection of Jesus strongly suggests that the world has a creator, and that creator is to be seen in terms of, through the lens of, Jesus. So, what is the evidence that it really happened? Okay, let me summarize the evidence under four headings. First of all, his absence from the tomb. The locus of the tomb was well known, and many theories have been put forward to explain why Jesus' body was absent from the tomb on that first Easter day, but none of them are very satisfactory. First of all, it's been suggested that, well, maybe Jesus didn't really die on the cross. Maybe he recovered in the cool of the tomb. But he'd undergone a Roman flogging that was enough to kill many people. And he had been crucified. People did not survive crucifixion. They had put a stone weighing 1.5 tons in front of that tomb. Furthermore, there's a very interesting piece of evidence. Would you like to turn to John chapter 19, just a few pages on? John chapter 19, verse 33. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. There appears to have been a separation of the clot and the serum, which we know today is strong medical evidence that Jesus was dead. They weren't aware of that at the time. They simply wrote it because that's what happened. So I think we can be sure that Jesus really had died. Other people have said, well, maybe the disciples came along and they stole the body and began a rumor that Jesus was risen. Leaving aside the fact that the tomb was guarded, the theory is psychologically improbable. Here were a group of people who were depressed, disillusioned. Something extraordinary must have happened to totally transform those people, so that they were willing to suffer. Many of them were tortured, lost their lives for what they believed about Jesus. Others have said, well, maybe the authorities stole the body. But that is absurd, because if the authorities have stole the body, all they needed to do when people were saying Jesus is risen from the dead was to produce it, but they never did. Others have said, well, maybe robbers stole the body. Interesting thing about that is there was only one valuable thing, so to speak, in that grave, and that is the grave clothes. When Peter and John had heard this rumor that Jesus was risen, they ran to the tomb. And when they got there, they found, that's why I haven't used the expression the empty tomb, they found that the tomb was not empty. The grave clothes were still there. Like an empty chrysalis from a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterfly has emerged. And the headpiece, the piece around Jesus' head, had been folded up and put in a separate place. And we're told that when John took one look at that evidence, he believed. So, first of all, his absence from the tomb. Second piece of evidence, his presence with the disciples. Some people have said, well, hallucination. People do hallucinate. Normally, it's highly strung, highly imaginative, and very nervous people, or people who are sick or on drugs. But the disciples don't fit into any of those categories. We're talking about burly fishermen, tax collectors. Tax collectors do not hallucinate. We're talking about cynics, skeptics. Thomas, who said, I'm not going to believe unless I see for myself. And then look at the number of them. Jesus appeared to over 500 people on 11 different occasions. Are all these people really likely to share the same hallucination? And then there's the nature of the appearances. Hallucinations are subjective. They have no objective reality. It's like seeing a ghost. Would you like to turn to Luke chapter 24, just a few pages back? Luke chapter 24, verse 36. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking that they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It's I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and he ate it in their presence. He ate with them. He cooked breakfast for them on one occasion. He had long conversations with them. And then there's his absence from the tomb, his presence with the disciples. Then there's the immediate effect, the transformation of these disciples, and the birth and explosive growth of the Christian church. Beginning with this handful of uneducated fishermen and tax gatherers, it swept across the whole known world in the next 300 years. It's an amazing story of a peaceful revolution that has no parallel in the history of the world. What was it that caused that? Unless it was the resurrection. Fourth piece of evidence is Christian experience down the ages. Countless millions of people down the ages have experienced Jesus Christ. People of every color, race, tribe, continent, nationality, from every economic, social, intellectual background, unite in a common experience of Christ. Wilson Carlyle, the founder of the Church Army, was preaching once at Hyde Park Corner. And he was preaching on this subject. He was saying, Jesus is alive. And there was a heckler at the back of the crowd who shouted out. He said, "How do you know he's alive?" Wilson Carlyle replied, "Well, I was speaking to him for half an hour this morning." That is the ultimate proof. The experience today of ordinary people, millions of them, all over the world. I could say that from my own experience over the last 26 years. Just like the other nearly 2,000 million Christians around the world, I've experienced his love, his power, his kindness, his mercy, his grace in my own life. And that is what convinces me that he's alive. So, in the light of what Jesus claimed about himself, there are those three logical possibilities. Either that he was insane, or that he was evil, or that he's God. Sherlock Holmes said this: "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." And as we look at that evidence about what he taught, what he did, his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, surely we can eliminate as impossible that he was insane or that he was evil. And therefore, as Sherlock Holmes put it, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. C.S. Lewis put it like this: we're faced then with a frightening alternative. The man we're talking about was and is just what he said, or else insane or worse. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither insane nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. May we pray? Perhaps you'd just like to bow your head. Many of you may not want to pray, but and as I said at the beginning, you don't have to do anything, but just perhaps for the sake of anyone who does want to pray, would like to bow your head for a moment. Father, we thank you that you have not left us without evidence, that we don't have to take a kind of blind leap of faith, but that we can take a step of faith based on good historical grounds, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I pray that you help each one of us on this course to take a step closer to you. In Jesus' name, amen. What do the following people have in common? Madonna, Sir Elton John, Jennifer Aniston, Robbie Williams, Naomi Campbell, and the Pope. One answer is that they all wear a cross. Many people today do go around with a little cross, either in their earrings, bracelet, lapel. I think probably the most common thing is a necklace, a little silver or a gold cross, sometimes a little wooden cross, or even quite a big wooden cross. I don't know whether it's ever struck you how, in some ways, how odd that is. Because